Welcome to another episode of the Audio Elgin podcast. This is your host, Abigail Fritz, and today I'll be speaking with Timothy Baylor. Timothy is a current Elgin resident, and he's going to be telling us about his fascinating life and about his family's tragic connection to the history of Elgin and of its railroads. Could you start by telling me your name and your date of birth?
Timothy Carl Baylor, in 1968.
And where were you born?
Victoria, Texas.
Is that where you grew up?
Yes, I went to St. Joe High School.
What did you do after high school?
9 days after I graduated, I went to the military. I went to boot camp, and then after boot camp in AITC, that's advanced training, I landed in Germany. I could have went into any of the four main Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, but when I was interviewing with the different recruiters, I said that one thing I want to do is to not stay in America. I wanted to go somewhere, so the Army is the one that promised me Germany, so I went with him.
So what did you do in Germany?
In Germany, I was with the Big Red One, and I drove a HEMTT for the Big Red One, and I delivered ammunition for M109ers.
What are those?
Those are howitzers. They're pretty big howitzers, and they can shoot rounds up to 8 miles far.
How long were you in Germany?
From 1987 to the end of 1989. I spent 16 more years in Germany as a civilian.
Why did you decide to stay?
I married a German.
That's a pretty good reason.
Yeah, I married a German, and then I stayed in a very, very small, tiny town called Lauingen. And I did several odd and end jobs at first, but I ended up going to the German post office school, and I worked at the German post office for a little bit over 10 years.
Could you tell me more about your experiences in the post office?
After I went there, I was able to get into a Frachtcentrum. It's a package center, and we worked about 130,000 packages a day. And I turned into a group leader, and with that, there was a lot of international people there. I worked with Turks, I worked with Romanians, Italians, British, Africans. I mean, there was a lot of different nationalities, and they were all speaking their own language. And it was something that I think that all Americans should do, is to spend some time in a foreign country, because it really opens up your eyes.
What brought you back to America?
There's a couple of reasons. The German post office, it was becoming no longer a government institute. The package center was bought out by DHL. The letter part, it turned into 4 different private companies that handle the letters. So, me being a government worker, they no longer wanted me around, so they started offering, severance packages. And also, we had taken care of my wife's parents, both of them, and they both passed away during my time there. And we hadn't spent much time with my parents here.
So was there an element of culture shock coming back to America after so long living in Germany?
Yes, extremely, because I learned how to be an adult in Germany. And I went over there like I say, just shortly after high school. And then the only American side of culture that I had was in the military. And that's extremely different than being a civilian in America.
When you came back to America, where were you living at that time?
When I came back, well, at first I was staying with my parents. My wife was closing down everything over there, and I stayed with my parents, and we were looking around, and I was thinking, it's probably better for a foreigner to find a job in a larger city. So I looked around Austin, and I ended up in Round Rock, and we moved there.
What brought you to Elgin?
We like the country and small city life. We looked for several years for a house in the country and land, and it took us quite a while to find what we were needing and wanting, and it just so happened that Elgin was the place. Elgin is one of those towns like I grew up in. There's those little historical events that they have, the parades and the community type events that they have. I like this small town. I like the antique stores and the mom and pop shops. I just hope that it keeps that small town vibe.
We first met when you visited the Elgin Depot Museum looking for information about a train crash that killed your grandfather and your uncle in 1967. Could you tell me about that train crash?
I had known since childhood that my grandfather got killed in a train wreck. My grandfather and my uncle, actually. But the family really never did talk about it. So I knew that it happened somewhere in Bastrop County. I didn't really know exactly where. So when I moved to Elgin, my mother came to my house for the first time. And she looked at me and she's like, you know that your grandfather passed away about 2 miles from your house. And so I was like, no. I've done genealogy for around 25 years now. It was mainly on my father's side of the family. And a couple of years ago, I started with my mother's side. And he was one of the focuses, especially since my mother revealed this new information. And so I started gathering information and I found the death certificate. And in both of the death certificates from my grandfather and my uncle, they both have in the description part, there's diesel pneumonia, and my grandfather, severe hits to the head. It was very interesting to me to find out more information. I did obtain a word-for-word manuscript from the court hearing that was conducted about the train wreck. What was very nerve-wracking is when I found it, the very first man listed that was part of being questioned for it was my grandpa on my father's side. He was on the train that left the 15 cars on the track. So the way that the wreck happened, it was about 3:45 at night, and they were coming north from Smithville, and they were going up to Waco area, Belmead, and right about just over there on Old Sayers Road, the train was taking that curve there, and 15 cars that were parked on a side rail had slipped out onto the main rail. And when the train turned the corner, hit those 15 cars. And when it hit the 15 cars, the engine that my grandfather and uncle were in went down about 30 foot. And my parents, my mother, she's opened up a little bit since I moved here. And she had told me that the police officers had said that my grandfather, when, he saw the cars that were on the track, he dove on top of my uncle, and they found him hovering my uncle.
And how old was your mother when this happened?
My grandfather was 44, and my uncle was 17 when they died. And so my mother, she was, this happened in June 3rd, 1967. And my mother was born in 1944. So let's do the math.
About 20 years.
About 20 years, so yes.
Had she already started dating your father?
Yes, they were already together. And I really haven't talked to my mother about that aspect. That may be something that there was conflict with, because my other grandfather, he was a conductor on the train, and they had questioned him because 3 days before the wreck, he was on the train that was going also, also in this route, but they were going from Waco to Smithville, and they dropped off
the gravel cars that slipped onto the tracks.
Yes, that slipped onto the tracks. So he was part of that crew, and in the court hearing, they questioned him about that. It seems to me like, from what I understand in the court papers, that the brakemen were directly involved with that, but he, as a conductor, he may have been able to see, them doing the job, of actually securing those cars properly. But since there's a curve at that point, he didn't see the actual action being taken.
So you have clearly put a lot of time and energy into researching your family history. Could you tell me why you think it's important that we do that?
everybody should know at least some about their family. I just think and feel that, if you don't research it and you don't pass it on, it's going to be lost. And, everybody has a desire to know how they fit in and who they are and where they came from. With this DNA test, it's actually brought a lot of new people into this hobby. Back when I started, I did everything through the mail and just asking around and sending letters through the mail and going to different courthouses and institutes where I can find documents, everything with ancestry and this new DNA. But with genealogy, like I say, it's something that I feel that everybody should know, who they are and where they came from.
As always, I'd like to thank Timothy for sharing his story with us. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, like and subscribe because we release a new episode every week. You can also visit us at the Elgin Depot Museum on Main Street, which includes exhibits on everything from railroads and agriculture to our various ethnic communities.